What's up, everybody, and welcome to this mini lecture on elements of poetry. So, before we get started, very much worth pointing out that a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this video is specific to poetry, but a lot of what we discussed in the videos on setting and theme and character, particularly symbol, figurative language, metaphor, these and allegory, these are very much applicable, these ideas very much applicable to poetry in the same way that they are applicable to fiction and to drama. But in this video, we want to be talking just a little bit about what makes poetry unique. So let's get started, shall we? Wanted to start by talking about sort of the building blocks of poetic form, particularly stanzas and verse paragraphs. Stanzas are collections of lines of poetry. They are blocks of lines of poetry. More often than not, especially in older poems, we see stanzas grouped together regularly. So a group of 2 lines, a set of 2 lines is called a couplet. Set of 3 lines, triplet or tercet. Set of 4 lines, a quatrain. The quatrain is actually, it's the most commonly used stanza form in English poetry. We see that over and over and over again. Verse paragraphs are similar but different to stanzas in the sense that there's not a break in line, there's not a line break in between verse paragraphs, but we'll see this particularly when we read Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. We see that it's broken into 3 distinct chunks, but they're not broken into but the poem isn't broken into stanzas in the way that something like, say, Donne's The Flea is. So poems made up of stanzas. We've got these sort of building blocks that they're pieced together. Sometimes they're separated out. Sometimes they are grouped together. For instance, an Elizabethan sonnet is 4 or 3 quatrains and a couplet. So it's 14 lines, 3 groups of 4 lines, and then 1 group of 2. Closed form or closed or fixed form poems are poems much like a sonnet that have a very particular form to them. They've got a set of rules that the poet has to follow. This can be like line number, this can be meter or rhythm, this can be rhyme scheme, this can be, stanza orientation, the list goes on. For instance, a sonnet is a poem that always has 14 lines. You will never find a sonnet that does not have 14 lines. If it does not have 14 lines, it ain't a sonnet. So, and then there are 2 primary forms of sonnet, which we will dive into separately in a separate video. But briefly overview, an Italian sonnet has an octave and a sestet, so it's divided into 2 groups, 8 lines and then 6 lines. Whereas, as I said before, the Elizabethan sonnet is quatrain, 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 and then a couplet. On the other hand, open form or free verse poetry doesn't have any kind of restrictions like this. This is where, stanzas aren't regular, rhythm or meter is not necessarily regular, rhyme scheme is either irregular or non-existent. These poems are really where poets are just kind of taking form wherever they want. So we'll dive a little bit further into all of these things shortly. So as far as poetic subgenres are concerned, there are really 3 primary ones that we are going to be looking at. We'll be looking at narrative poetry, and this is poetry that tells a story. And it has a narrative to it. This is primarily something that we see with a lot of epic poetry, like the Odyssey, the Iliad, Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, Beowulf. These are long, lengthy poems that tell us a story they have all the stuff that we were talking about with plot in our separate video. That's all present there. Dramatic poetry is poetry designed to be performed, poetry very much along the lines of what a character might speak. And we see this play out in primarily for us, the form of the dramatic monologue. For instance, when we read Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. This is a single character delivering a speech as if he were, a character on stage as part of a play. And then finally, we have lyric poetry, which is the one that you may be the most familiar with already. And these are poems, initially designed to be kind of accompanied by a lute or a lyre, and very sort of musical in a sense. It's less story driven, less character driven, and more trying to convey an emotion, convey a feeling, convey a purpose. So let's talk rhythm within the line. Rhythm is the repetition of stressed or unstressed syllables. So when we're talking about a stress, we're talking about a syllable that has an emphasis on it. Unstressed syllables are the ones that do not have an emphasis. A caesura is this, it's a pause that takes place generally right in the middle of a line, kind of where, like, if you were to kind of speak a line of poetry and you're taking like the slightest little bit of breath in the middle of a line, that would be a caesura. Run-on lines are lines that we don't have a period or an exclamation point or a question mark or anything like that stopping our line. And so we do what's called an enjambment. We just we read straight along to the next line of poetry. So just off the top of my head, an example that kind of comes to mind for me is one of Shakespeare's sonnets that starts, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. That admit impediments is the first two words of the second line. But because there's no like comma or period, full stop, at the end of that line, you read straight on. The rhythm just kind of flows right through. The only time you actually stop when you are at the end of a line of poetry is when there is a punctuation mark there that tells you, hey, stop. So meter, on the other hand, so that all describes rhythm. We're talking about stresses, we're talking about pauses, we're talking about how we move and how we run on from line to line, or if we stop at the end of each line. Meter talks about a regular, reoccurring pattern of sounds, of pauses, of stresses and unstressed syllables. And we measure that with poetic feet. And this, again, a poetic feet is a unit of identifying and measuring poetic meter. The one that you're probably the most familiar with already is the I am, which is one unstressed syllable followed by one stressed syllable. Another one that you've probably seen, but you may not have recognized it, is a trochee, which is one stressed syllable followed by one unstressed syllable. And then a few other common poetic feet that we see in English poetry are anapaests, which are two unstressed syllables followed by one stressed syllable, dactyls, which are one stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables, and spondees, which are two stressed syllables right back and forth right after one another. So meter is determined by how many poetic feet appear in a line of poetry. Iambic pentameter, so 5 iambs per line. Penta, which means 5, 5 iambs per line, iambic pentameter. This is where we get that, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. You could kind of map that out. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks. Not that we actually speak like that, not that we actually read the poem like that, read the play that way. But you get the idea. So as far as sound effects, one of the biggest things that I think is really important for us to remember about poetry is the fact that poetry really comes to life when we read it aloud. It's not the type of thing where we look at it on the page and it's there and it looks kind of cool and it looks a little bit weird, but like, we read it and then we internalize it and we don't really think about it. Poetry is meant to be read aloud. So sound plays a huge role in the overall effect of a poem. So a few commonly used sound effects are alliteration, which is the repetition of consonant sounds at, when we're talking, initial alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's very kind of cheesy alliteration. Assonance is it's basically the same idea but applied to vowel sounds. Cacophony is when sounds come together to create this really harsh and kind of discordant feeling and vibe with us. The words, they don't sound very nice together, and it just kind of grates on us, and it makes us really, like, just hearing the words makes us feel uncomfortable. And again, the opposite of that is euphony, which by hearing, the way that the music of the words and the way that they play together, it creates this really like pleasing sound and it makes us feel good. Onomatopoeia, which I think, aside from alliteration, maybe the one that the most of you are already familiar with. This is the representation of sounds. Pow, bang. It feels like the best example of that is to point to like the 1967 Batman. Pow, bip, bop, dang. I don't know, whatever. Representing, using words to represent and that look like the sounds that they're designed to represent. And then finally, the most commonly, known one is rhyme. We have three primary types of rhyme in poetry. We've got end rhyme, which is when the vowel sounds that occur at the end of a line of poetry match exactly. Internal rhyme is when those matching vowel sounds appear inside each line or inside a line of poetry. It's not just the ends of the lines. And then consonance is when the vowel sounds don't match, but the consonant sounds do. So this is where like rain and run would, slant rhyme because we have that N sound at the end of those words. We see this a lot in, and probably the most famous user of slant rhyme is the poet Emily Dickinson, and we will be seeing that in some of her work this semester. So that about does it for this mini lecture. Thank you all very much, and I will see you all in the next one.